I'm Julie Butler, and I want to talk to you about different material relationships that you'll find in historic buildings, specifically mortar and bricks. So here we've got a lot of mortar and a lot of bricks, but the relationship that they have is very important. See, bricks are the primary building material, and as such, we want to make sure that any sort of deterioration happens to the secondary or sacrificial material that surrounds the bricks, the mortar. The reason we want that is because the bricks actually have a really long lifespan if treated well. Mortar, however, has a lifespan of about 50 to 100 years because it is the sacrificial material. So how do we determine which is the sacrificial material and which is not? Is simply by the hardness of the material. Water is going to get into a building, it's going to get on the face of the building. Water makes valleys out of mountains. So we can't win against water, so let's work with it. We want to make sure that water can escape. Water will always choose the path of least resistance, which means it will choose the material that is the least hard. We want that to be the mortar because we've chosen that to be the sacrificial material. And so we need to make sure that any mortar that is used in a historic structure is not as hard as the brick. So historic brick compared to modern brick is not as hard because it was typically handmade, pressed into a mold made of clay and sand, and then dried, and then fired in a kiln so that it would get that exterior weatherproof skin. The mortar around it needs to be less hard than that. If the mortar that is used is improper, such as a Portland cement-based mortar, which is a much more modern material, what you're going to have is something like this, where the water is escaping through the brick. We see evidence of this here because the salts that are in the water are actually it's efflorescence here on the exterior of the brick. That's just salt that was in the water that as it leaves the brick, it remains on the surface. Efflorescence up here specifically will start doing things like this, where the entire fired skin of the brick starts to simply fall off. You get brick dust around the edge of your building and right where that has essentially turned back into sand. We know that the hardness of the mortar is the culprit because we're literally only seeing it on the bricks that are surrounded by this specific repair. Portland cement is a modern mortar and can be used with modern brick because of modern manufacturing practices. Modern bricks are harder and more resilient, so they can be next to a hard mortar like Portland cement. Historic bricks, or bricks from essentially before the 1930s, should always have historic lime mortar, which is simply mortar that has lime and sand, versus Portland cement, which is mortar that has lime and clay. If a building is older than 90 years old or before the 1930s, you're going to want to make sure that any mortar that you use is natural hydraulic lime mortar or any sort of lime mortar because of its breathability and its hardness. It's simply not as hard as historic brick, and as a result will allow the historic brick to be the primary material and will make the mortar the sacrificial material. If your building is newer than from the 1930s, you can use Portland cement, and the bricks can typically take it, and that won't be a problem. We can repair this with brick patch or a new fired skin. However, the hard Portland cement mortar does need to be removed before any of this is done because this will continue to happen, especially when you have specifically wet winters. A wet winter would be bad because as water goes into the brick and then freezes overnight, in some cases it can actually pop the whole face of the brick off. This can be repaired, not all hope is lost. First, we would remove the hard mortar around the brick, and then we would try and either repair the brick if it needs to be repaired or simply clean that efflorescence off. In this case, it is just salts, but sometimes those salts can calcify, and we do have cleaning products for that can remove the calcification but leave the brick intact and safe.